Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Noir Afloat, Tony Cornero and the Notorious Gambling Ships of Southern California, by Ernest Marquez. Narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Preface. From 1920 to 1933, the Volstead Act, or Prohibition, was in effect throughout the United States. Transportation, sale, and production of liquor was banned by the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Despite the law, enterprising bootleggers and rum runners saw to it that Southern Californians who wanted liquor could have it, for a price. There were speakeasies in Los Angeles where you could buy a drink if you knew the password. Rum runners smuggled liquor into California from Canada and became millionaires. In 1929, the stock market crashed, leading to the Great Depression. Los Angeles was no different than any place else. Jobs were scarce, and many people stood in soup lines for a meal. Still, regardless of the difficulty almost everybody faced in maintaining a decent lifestyle, there were those who seemed to have enough money to squander it away by gambling. Some public officials, who had promised to abide by the words in their oaths and by the rules and regulations of their office, reneged on that pledge. A few accepted bribes to do the bidding of lawbreakers, or to look the other way when unlawful activity took place. Even some police departments were corrupt. Cynics claimed it was difficult to distinguish between the criminals and the police. Los Angeles was like any other big city, where crime and corruption in all its forms were part of the everyday problems confronting honest officials and law-abiding citizens. During this period, gambling operators seized the opportunity to create a new industry along the California coast: gambling ships. Gambling ship operators had no compassion for the downtrodden. They saw their patrons only as a source of income. If an individual was foolish enough to think he was going to win, he was ripe for the professional to empty his pockets, sending him home depressed and broke. The job of the operators was not to feel sorry for those they fleeced. It was their job to make gamblers feel as if they had a chance of winning, even though the odds were against it. Casino-type or percentage gambling was against the law within California's borders, but not on the open sea beyond the 3-mile limit. The genius of the gambling ship operators was to anchor their casinos at sea just beyond the territorial limit and shuttle customers to them in water taxis. They advertised in the newspapers. They offered free passes, free dinners, free drinks, and free rides to lure customers to visit these unusual floating casinos. Who could turn that down? The public embraced the gambling ships as an entertaining distraction from the stresses of everyday life. People came by the thousands to lose their money. Local, state, and federal authorities were at a loss to figure out how to shutter the gambling ships. City and state laws applied only within the state's borders, with the gambling ships seemingly beyond their reach. From 1927 to 1939, a succession of ships avoided the law and prospered. But in 1939, along came California's crusading Attorney General, Earl Warren. He brought the gambling ship era to its end, creating a story more fascinating than any Raymond Chandler classic. Part 1. Tony Cornero Strala. 1. The City of the Angels is not. Los Angeles in the 1920s and 1930s was promoted as a veritable earthly paradise, a blessed land of sunshine and the healthiest possible place to live. It was proclaimed the nation's fastest-growing city, where land was cheap and opportunities to get rich were unlimited. What the promoters didn't mention was the seamy side of Los Angeles. A number of the city's highest elected officials were incompetent at best and dishonest at worst, and career civil servants openly accepted bribes. The Los Angeles Police Department was not only ineffectual but corrupt. Critics claimed the police were no better than the city's criminals, and that it was often difficult to distinguish between the two. In 1921, George Cryer became mayor, promising to combat crime and reform the police department. By the time he left office in 1929, Cryer had appointed no fewer than 5 different chiefs of police. Their collective previous experience totaled close to 0. Each in turn attempted one or another type of departmental reorganization. None succeeded. Following Cryer, Mayors John C. Porter and Frank L. Shaw pledged to correct the sorry state of municipal affairs, but proved reluctant or unable to implement reform. Not until in 1938, when Fletcher Bowron was elected, would any real reform occur. Major crime was rife in the 1920s Los Angeles, and an underworld mob known as the Big Five, or the Spring Street Gang, was responsible for most of it. The mob's leader, Charles Crawford, who owned both the Maple Bar on 5th Street and a real estate office on Sunset Boulevard, boasted openly of having direct access, by way of a private telephone line, to all the right places in City Hall. Crawford's mob worked as a team, but its members avoided any appearance of being linked. His mob included Albert Marco, a.k.a. Marco Albori, who controlled prostitution in the city, the brothers Joe and Bob Gans, who manufactured slot machines, Captain Guy McAfee, who was in charge of the Los Angeles Police Department's vice squad, known as the Purity Squad, and ran a number of gambling houses on the side, Milton B. Farmer Page, who operated a bookie joint in his office on Spring Street, Tudor Scherer, a promoter and gambler who ran casinos as far away as Palm Springs, Chuck Addison, who was deeply involved in gambling, and Ezekiel Zeke Caress, a millionaire gambler, handicapper, and betting commissioner affiliated with the Agua Caliente racetrack in Tijuana. The rackets in Los Angeles were ruled by Jack Dragna, a ruthless mafioso who operated independently of Crawford's mob until he began to appreciate the extent of its gambling and bookmaking ventures and determined to cut himself in on the take. When Guy McAfee got wind of this and scornfully asked, "Who the hell is Jack Dragna?" he found out in short order. Dragna's henchmen held up McAfee's bookie joints and roughed up his runners to the tune of thousands of dollars. Dragna was cut in. But more significantly, mafia-style violence and murder entered the Los Angeles gaming community. Separate from the Spring Street Gang, bootleggers Marvin Doc Schuweiler and Tony Cornero Strala both ran their own multi-million-dollar syndicates smuggling liquor into California during Prohibition. In 1927, the $150 million Julian petroleum oil swindle, of dimensions to rival Teapot Dome, was uncovered in Los Angeles and riveted the attention of Angelenos for months to come. Grand jury indictments of perpetrators of this criminal fraud were handed down in July of 1927, but the trial was postponed until the end of January 1928. Instead of prosecuting the case himself, District Attorney Asa Keyes put his protege and former secretary, only recently accepted by the California Bar and almost completely inexperienced in trial work, in charge of it. In May, when the jury finally had been selected and the trial was underway at last, Keyes suddenly announced that he planned to retire in 6 months. At one point during the trial proceedings, he asked the judge to dismiss charges against 3 of the defendants on grounds there was no evidence to prove them guilty. Keyes, who had been in the courtroom only a few times during the trial, delivered the prosecution's closing statement. He astounded his audience, bewildered the jury, and directly contradicted the evidence put forward by his own deputy prosecutors by zeroing in on only one of the 7 remaining defendants, declaring 2 others innocent, expressing doubts about the guilt of 2 others, and barely mentioning the remaining 2. A day later, the baffled jurors found all 7 men not guilty. 5 months later came the revelation that Keyes had accepted bribes to guarantee acquittals. Refusing to resign, he insisted on finishing out the month left of his term. The Los Angeles Times of October 28, 1928, solemnly proclaimed that the confidence of the public in its elected servants, the foundation point of the community, has been undermined to the danger point. Keyes was eventually brought to trial by Burr and Fitz, his successor as district attorney, and sentenced to 8 to 10 years in San Quentin. In 1929, John R. Porter, a former auto parts dealer, became mayor of Los Angeles. In his effort to reform the police department, he demoted Chief of Police James Edgar Davis and appointed Davis's subordinate Dick Steckel to the post. Soon, Steckel himself became a figure in a major crime that decisively ended the career of mob leader Charles Crawford. On May 21, 1931, Crawford and Herbert Spencer, editor of a reform-minded magazine, The Critic of Critics, was gunned down in Crawford's real estate office in a double murder rendered more sensational when David Clark, a former deputy district attorney and a candidate for a judgeship, confessed to the killings. Taken into custody, Clark stated that Crawford and Spencer had proposed that he set up Chief Steckel for blackmail by sending him to a house in Santa Monica where he could then be discovered consorting with prostitutes. Clark claimed that when he turned down this proposition, Crawford became irate and reached for his gun, whereupon, in self-defense, Clark pulled his own gun and shot both men. Indicted and tried for murder, Clark experienced a mistrial before his next trial produced a verdict of not guilty. Clark walked out of court a free man. Los Angeles's next mayor, Frank L. Shaw, elected in 1933, pledged to deal effectively with the new and severe social and economic problems the city was experiencing as a result of the Great Depression and the inherited issue of internal corruption, particularly in the police department. Partway into his first term, however, he found himself the object of a wave of public detraction, spearheaded by the Reverend Robert P. Bob Schuller, a well-known and highly articulate Methodist minister. Claiming that under Mayor Shaw, there is more vice, more crime, more debauchery, more graft in this city than there ever was before in its history, Reverend Schuller's denunciatory sermons and radio broadcasts astounded and aroused his listeners. His relentless anti-crime, anti-mayor, and anti-lawyer crusade earned him the sobriquet of Fighting Bob. Shaw spent much of his time defending himself against Fighting Bob and his adherents. He made little or no progress in the direction of reform, and for the most part, the public seemed disinclined to care. Managing to stay fed, clothed, and sheltered during a depression was too heavy a burden to allow time or energy for becoming active in civil reform. Before Shaw finished his term as mayor, he was recalled and kicked out of office. The passage of the Volstead Act in 1920 had ushered in an era unlike any the nation had ever experienced. Prohibition generated a change in people's attitudes toward ethical and moral absolutes, as well as a shift in the economy. Products soon appeared that allowed everyone to make their own hooch. In California, grape growers produced the California brick, a block of compressed grapes, an illegal item which sold for $2. From it, the buyer could supposedly derive a tasty grape punch. Helpful instructions printed on each package warned against dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, adding sugar, shaking daily, and decanting after 3 weeks. Clearly a recipe for homemade wine. To a limited extent, California wineries were able to continue production by making wine for religious or medicinal purposes. The latter category included wine tonics or wine elixirs, purported to be beneficial to health. Enterprises called pharmacal laboratories popped up in Los Angeles, selling such concoctions as Peptol and Elixol, which were nothing more than port or sherry wine fortified with 20 to 22% alcohol. These were ways to get around the law, but bootleggers and rum runners depended on the fact that there was no way Americans would give up their freedom to drink, and they made illegal liquor available to anyone with the means to pay. Ultimately, the proliferation of speakeasies and gambling casinos in back rooms of nightclubs in Los Angeles proper and all across Los Angeles County, with little or no interference from the police, became more than the average law-abiding citizen was willing to put up with. Reformers began pressuring the authorities to close such gambling establishments, and to put a stop to the crimes associated with them. The only result of their efforts was a series of token raids that looked impressive, but never put the targeted speakeasy or casino permanently out of business. Casino-type gambling at this time was illegal in California. Nevertheless, a group of innovative gambling operators openly and flagrantly plied their trade just slightly out of reach of the law by locating casinos on vessels anchored in Pacific waters, slightly more than 3 miles from the shore. Even if a coastal town or city in Southern California had ordinances prohibiting gambling, its jurisdiction extended only to its shoreline. The same was the case for county authority jurisdiction. These gambling ships caused consternation among Southern California reformers and wrought havoc among infuriated city, county, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Furthermore, law enforcement agencies had to confront a perplexing question: who had jurisdiction over these offshore casinos? Far from being undercover, these pleasure palaces were visible from the shore by day and by night. Using newspaper and radio advertising, their operators broadcast their presence and attractions over the entire Southland. The gambling ship operators mailed and handed out thousands of invitations to the public, promising free shore-to-ship-to-shore transportation, free dinner on board, and diversified entertainment. Despite the deliberately innocuous wording of this publicity, the fact that the ships offered gambling games of every sort rapidly became the talk of the town. Civil authorities faced a jurisdictional problem in determining how to eliminate this ostensibly illegal industry. State laws prohibited gambling casinos and percentage gambling within California's borders, but while its inland borders were well defined, its ocean border at that time became the subject of contention because it did not follow the natural curvature of the shoreline, but lay 3 miles out to sea along an imaginary line known as the 3-mile limit. There was an exception to this where a bay existed, in which case the 3-mile limit lay 3 miles beyond an imaginary straight line connecting the bay's 2 headlands. The exact position of the 3-mile limit in areas such as Santa Monica Bay, San Pedro Bay, and the Santa Barbara Channel became a heated debate between the gambling ship operators and local state and federal authorities, and consequently, a matter for the courts to decide. The waters from 3 to 12 miles offshore were under federal control. At that time, the federal government had no laws against gambling on land or sea. Beyond 12 miles from shore, the Pacific became part of international waters, where ships were subject only to the international laws of the sea. Taking advantage of the convenient absence of federal anti-gambling legislation, casino operators positioned their vessels inside federal waters and hired water taxis to ferry their patrons to them, to the utter frustration of local and state authorities. A dozen different gambling ships operated from 1927 to 1939, each with its own owners or partners and backers. For the most part, these operators strived to remain anonymous to avoid the law. A flamboyant and outspoken man named Tony Cornero was the big exception. He was his own public relations agent, and he made every effort to get his name in the paper, and he was determined to be known as the admiral of the gambling ship fleet. 2. King of the Rum Runners. Anthony Cornero Strala was born on August 19, 1900, on a farm in Italy's Piedmont district at the foot of the Alps. In 1904, his parents, Luigi and Maddalena Pira Cornero, together with their sons, 6-year-old Francis and 4-year-old Anthony, immigrated to the United States. The little family settled in Los Gatos, California, a community of farms and vineyards south of San Francisco, already largely peopled by their countrymen. Barely a year later, Luigi Cornero was killed in an accident, and the widowed Maddalena subsequently married another immigrant, Giacomo Strala. Tony and Frank, as they were known by that time, assumed their stepfather's surname, and when Giacomo was naturalized in 1914, they too acquired American citizenship. As time went on, they would also acquire a half-brother, Louis Strala, and two half-sisters, Catherine and Madeline Strala. Throughout his life, Tony remained close to the family and devoted to his mother. He also retained a romantic pride in his origins, often expounding on the subject. The Piedmont, he would declaim, is not the part of Italy that breeds guitar players, opera singers, or the lower brackets of racketeers, if I do say so myself. The Piedmontese are a tough and hardy race of men who till the soil and live to be 90 and up. Tony, too, was tough and hardy, and in him the Piedmont had bred a racketeer of the highest order, one doomed for that very reason not to make it to 90. In 1915, when he was 15 years old, Tony Cornero was convicted on 3 counts of robbery and sent to reform school. In 1918, he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve, from which, after a summary court-martial, he was discharged 6 months later for violation of orders, jumping ship, and remaining AWOL for various periods. After that, he drove a taxi in San Francisco until Prohibition became the law of the land in 1920. 5 years later, Tony Cornero, by then an ace at smuggling liquor into the United States, was a millionaire and the acknowledged king of Southern California rum runners. He had accumulated a fleet of the largest and highest-powered speedboats money could buy, plenty of trucks and places to store contraband liquor, and a vast stable of rum runners and agents. Almost all the liquor smuggled into California during Prohibition came from Canada, and the Cornero brothers, Frank Cornero was Tony's right-hand man, brought in only the best Scotch whiskey. All the other stuff coming in, declared Tony, was poisonous. Operations as large as those of the Corneros were highly decentralized enterprises. Cases of whiskey came south by the thousands in large vessels known as motherships, which dropped anchor at predetermined rendezvous locations in international waters, usually between 30 and 50 miles offshore. The Southern California coastline was far from ideal for smuggling. It lacked the hidden inlets and rocky apertures of the northern Pacific and Atlantic coasts. As a result, the process demanded darkness, silence, and maximum speed, and the rum runners had to carefully make do with relatively unconcealed landing sites. The high-powered speedboats would race out to a mothership, load the contraband, and speed back toward land, cutting their engines just clear of the surf line. At that point, the lucrative cargo would be shifted into dories, rowed to shore, and loaded into waiting trucks. The loaded trucks, with armed guards hanging on, ready to protect the haul from hijackers, transported the contraband to one or another safe location for temporary storage. Tony's booze was expensive, but it wasn't all profit. With every shipment, he had to pay off dozens of people, colluding agents within the Canadian Exporting Company, and at the mothership's stated Mexican or Central American destination to supply with false papers, the ship's captain and crew, the speedboat, dory, and truck crews, the armed guards, the owners of the storage locations and any nearby residents, and various local officials. All this expense, plus a hefty profit for Tony, meant that a bottle of Cornero's liquor could go for $65 or more. There was no secret about the identity of the big smugglers. Law enforcement authorities, and a good percentage of the public, knew well who they were. But they were frustrated by the fact that under the law they could arrest a ringleader only by catching him red-handed in possession of contraband within U.S. jurisdiction. At 25 years of age, Tony Cornero was riding high. His business cards indicated he was an importer and broker. He resided in a Beverly Hills mansion he had purchased for his mother. His public persona was that of a prosperous and friendly young businessman who mingled freely with both society figures and gambling racketeers, gladly spoke to the press, and wanted the world to know that he was engaged in saving citizens from poisoning themselves with rot-gut liquor. In the spring of 1926, Cornero traveled to British Columbia to arrange for a gigantic shipment of 4,000 burlap bags, 48,000 bottles, of good Scotch to be shipped from Vancouver to Los Angeles. The consignment was to be loaded early in June aboard a mothership of Panamanian registry, the Chasina, which would sail south for about 6 weeks, reaching a rendezvous point some 150 miles off the Southern California coast of a location of quiet sea known as Tanner's Bank. It would take more speedboats than Cornero had to bring that much liquor ashore at one time, so he temporarily increased his fleet. Amex Oil Company owned an elegant, 84-foot, diesel-powered yacht named the Donosari. She was usually anchored at Wilmington, but mooring space was reserved for her at Long Beach as well. Unbeknownst to her owners, but not to Tony, the Donosari had already taken part in a few rum-running expeditions. He now contacted the 2 men in charge of operating her, Gordon Grimstead and James Cunliffe, and arranged a deal. Early on the morning of July 20th, 1926, the Donosari, with Captain Grimstad at the helm and Cornero and 1 or 2 of his henchmen aboard, left for Wilmington berth and headed out to sea to meet the waiting Chasina. Heavy waves slowed them down, and in the vicinity of Tanner's Bank, the sea was so rough and unruly that the Chasina's captain, H. Robinson, deemed it too dangerous for the big yacht to tie up alongside. The only option was to drop anchor nearby and use the Donosari's dory to transfer the contraband cargo. A grim-faced and already frustrated at the loss of time, Cornero and his men began rowing back and forth, unloading the whiskey several bags at a time. They worked all through the night and into the next day, when an alarmed Captain Grimstad, afraid the yacht would be swamped, called a halt. Every available inch of space on the Donosari was filled with burlap bags, more than 800 in all. She was so weighed down that seawater was coming up through the sink outlets in her galley and head. Late in the afternoon of July 22nd, the overloaded yacht began her wallowing journey back to land. A worried Cornero knew the men and equipment scheduled to meet her would no longer be waiting at Shore Point, and he ordered Grimstad to steer for Long Beach. Around 3 a.m. on July 23rd, the Donosari tied up to a piling in a deserted part of Long Beach Harbor. Ordering Grimstad to go home and keep his mouth shut, Cornero and his sidekicks took off to make new arrangements for completing what had become an extremely high-risk operation. Cornero would have been more worried had he known that even as the yacht was on her way to the Chasina, the president of Amex Oil, J.F. White, had issued orders for her to move from Wilmington to Long Beach. When the Donosari did not show up in a reasonable amount of time, he had told the police that he suspected she was engaged in illegal activity. The Donosari lay unmolested until late that afternoon, when White decided to search for her himself and found her in the infrequently used Harbor Channel 3, looking considerably the worse for wear. With a surprising lack of caution, given the possibilities, he climbed aboard at once. Her interior was locked, but by peering through the windows of her salon, he could see bags piled to the ceiling. Guessing their contents, he debarked and went straight to police headquarters. A tug was sent out to tow her in, and by early evening she was properly moored at a municipal dock. Long Beach police broke open her hatches and realized instantly they would need more than their own vehicles to carry the sacks to proper storage. They called the fire department for help and then set to work unloading the bags. The biggest available fire truck was pressed into service, along with police cars and policemen's private autos. The fire truck made no fewer than 10 round trips to City Hall, where the bags were stowed on the upper floors. By midnight, the job was only half finished. In all, it took 10 hours to confiscate the 806 loaded burlap bags. The police noticed a man loitering in his car at one end of the dock, gazing fixedly at the unloading scene, sensed he might be in some way connected with the crime, and took him in for questioning. He identified himself as Louis Donalds, readily gave them a San Pedro address, answered their queries in a friendly and relaxed fashion, but gave them no reason to believe he had anything to do with the yacht or its contents, so they released him. The man was Tony Cornero. Shortly thereafter, federal agents arrived. The identity of the Donosari's captain was ascertained, along with his nearby address. Police stationed themselves.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?